Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Helen Paynter and it's been my joy to be hosting this summer season of Politics in the Pulpit. My guest today is Isabella Senior. Isabella is the Young Leaders Development Coordinator for Baptists Together. She's from Brazil and grew up church planting with her family. She first came to the UK on age 15 on a mission trip when she heard God speak to her about not waiting to be older to serve Jesus and to focus on reaching younger generations. And she moved here at the age of 18. Isabella, it's great to have you with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Helen. What a privilege to be here and to be sharing all the different passages and talking a little bit about what the Bible has to say about politics and our lives and everything in between. So yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation and glad to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to it as well. Now, you and I had a little conversation just before we started recording, and I said I was going to ask you about whether politics and the pulpit go together. And I think you've got a particularly helpful and interesting, perhaps broader perspective than sometimes we imagine. So go for it.
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, I grew up in Brazil. I'm from Brazil and lived there for my childhood. And even though I'm here in the UK, I'm connected with politics in Brazil and in the UK because I'm not a British citizen here yet. So my understanding of politics has been shaped by my upbringing in Brazil. So a country in Latin America where I don't know if people that are watching this, if you guys have been watching what has been happening in Brazilian politics for the past, I don't know, 10 years, 10 years. It hasn't been good. It hasn't been a good mix of politics and the pulpit. It hasn't been a good mix of churches getting involved with politics in a way that is unhelpful. I have friends who have left their churches, who have actually left faith altogether because of the way the politics have been mixed in the pulpit in Brazil. So this is an issue that's really close to my heart. People that I grew up with that had moments in their churches where they thought, no, we need to draw a line here. This is not healthy, and this is actually quite far from how we understand God and what churches are supposed to be and represent in society. So I think the question I would pose back if politics mixed with the pulpit is, what do you mean by politics? What's your understanding of politics? And I think what I'm saying here is political affiliation. I don't think there's space for political affiliation in the pulpit. I think it needs to be a space of conversation, of discussion, of exploration, but not a space where we're telling people what to do, and not a space, especially we're telling people who to vote for. And I think, unfortunately, this is what has happened in Brazil, in my perspective. And I think this is what I wouldn't want to see happening anywhere else because I can see the damage of it. However, if we're talking about politics, about the way that we manage our countries, our societies, and the rules and laws that govern the way that we live life, that protect the vulnerable, that support those that need it the most, that make sure that people have what to eat on their tables, that make sure that people have a place to live, then absolutely, it would be really silly not to mention that. And I think it wouldn't be coherent with what we read in the Bible, to not talk about justice, to not talk about peace, to not talk about power and the influence that it has in everything that we do, and yes, including in our churches and the people that are sitting there, the people that are being part of our churches. All of us, we are inserted in a country and a society that has laws and rules, and we have a political responsibility. So in that case, if that's what we mean by politics, absolutely has a place in the pulpit, and that's why I'm passionate about it.
Thank you. That's a really helpful perspective and an important warning, as well as being enthusiastic in the way that you said, but also a warning about the power of the pulpit. Yeah, we've seen that in many places at both contemporary times and across history.
Yeah.
Right. Let's just talk about the news headlines as they stand at the time of recording.
Mm-hmm.
So prisons across England have activated emergency measures, Operation Early Dawn, to cope with overcrowding after the recent rioting across the country. This means that people can be held in police cells until prison beds are available and this can cause uncertainty about court dates. Pupils are receiving A-level results last week had the best results in a generation, and GCSE results are coming this week. Ceasefire talks in Doha about Israel-Palestine have ended in disappointment. And a global health emergency has been declared by the WHO as monkeypox cases spread outside Africa. Plenty there to be praying about and potentially bringing into connection with our readings. So what are our readings for this coming Sunday? We've got 1 Kings chapter 8, mainly focusing on verses 22 to 30 and 41 to 43, but the lectionary recommends that in order to put that into context, we need a few verses from earlier in the chapter. So that's the dedication of the temple by Solomon. Lots to talk about there, I think, in a minute. Continuing our journey through Ephesians, we've now reached Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 20, the very familiar passage about spiritual armour and the spiritual battle. We are, I think, probably concluding the Bread of Life discourse and moving slightly out of it as we continue through John 6, verses 56 to 69. And we have Psalm 84, one of my personal favourites, which I'm looking forward to discussing with Isabella in a couple of minutes. So those are our readings. Isabella, you've had a chance to have a muse on them over the last few days. Do you see themes that run beyond one particular reading and are found in several?
Yeah, I do. I think for me, what stands out is the theme of home. Starting from Psalm 84, and saying how lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty, how much I want to be with you and long to be with you. And I think in reading Psalm 84, it kind of shapes the way that I read the other passages as well. So Solomon building the temple, building a home for God, a dwelling place for God and for the people to worship as well. And then looking at John, the bread of life, talking about, as you said, Jesus being the bread of life. And there's something about provision there as well that I thought was quite interesting. And then when we get to Ephesians 6, it's talking about standing firm, and understanding the source of evil in the world. And I think all these themes and different issues connect with the theme of home for me. And yeah, so that's what it's been on my mind.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, let's go a little bit deeper then. And let's begin with the 1 Kings reading, 1 Kings 8. So here we've got Solomon bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the newly built temple, and the glory of God comes down upon the temple. So the priests have to withdraw for a time, and then Solomon prays this great prayer of dedication. We've got the first half of it here. What do you notice here then?
Yeah, so in that passage, I think what came to my mind, or what I've been reflecting on here, is the presence of the Lord wanting to be where people are. And the prayer that Solomon does and saying, Lord, come and be here with us. We need you, and he lists a number of different situations and circumstances that people will be in, and saying, but when they turn to you, and they turn to the temple and remember that you are there and remember your presence, they will be comfort. They'll receive guidance. And I think that's what particularly stood out to me in that passage. There's a lot there. There's a lot that we can unpack. And I think for you preaching on Sunday, there's a lot that you can draw out of that passage. But I don't know about you, but when I'm doing talks, is that balance of how much to share in the short space of time that we have. And I think in my personal approach, the way that I do things, I'm trying to stir curiosity. I'm not going to give all the answers if all the questions are not have been asked. I'm going to give the big picture, talk about it, and stir some questions and ask people why and help them to reflect on that. Probably do talks in a way that's conversational so people can share what they've been thinking and how that connects to them, or using resources through technology, things like Mentimeter, where people can feedback their reflections. So for me in that passage, there's a verse, I'm just trying to find it, but it's a verse about the foreigner. And that speaks to me because I'm a foreigner in this land. And even when I go to Brazil, I feel like a foreigner as well. So my sense of identity is different from most people because I call two places home.
Mm,
And when I read this passage and it says about, when the foreigner comes, and they will come because of the name of the Lord, because of the temple, because they want to connect with God. And then these will be a place for them to meet with God. And when I read that, I'm thinking about the temple, I'm thinking about everything that the passage is sharing here, and there's a lot of meaning behind it and promises being fulfilled. But on my perspective, I'm also thinking, yeah, I want that home. I want that home where there'll be a place of encounter with God, where everyone is welcome, even people that are not from that particular country, where
mm,
foreigners are welcome, where people find home, and where they find home in God, where they meet with God. So I think from this passage, this was a particular verse that stood
great.
out to me. And then, there are other circumstances, people in wars, there are people that are struggling for lots of different reasons, as he mentioned in the passage. And I think that's a place of comfort of the temple not only being a place of worship, which is very important, but a place of belonging as well. People finding their home in that space, and praying towards it and connecting with it in that way. So yeah, so that's what stands out to me in that passage, and I think that's what I would want to dig a little bit deeper,
Mm.
and see where it would take as a church, as a congregation, whoever would be speaking to.
I think that's so helpful, isn't it? Because this is sometimes we imagine that Old Testament Israel was kind of hermetically sealed. There's a lot of language around in the Old Testament around the election of Israel and
Mm.
God's love for Israel. And sometimes if we read, if we don't really dig deep and notice some of the slightly less obvious themes in Scripture, then we imagine that there is this exclusive love that God has for Israel, for Old Testament Israel. And what you pick up here with this language of the foreigner being able to participate, being invited, drawn in, is a very significant theme that runs through, and it runs through from the word go, from the election of from the call of Abraham in Genesis 12 all the way through. We see those who are outside, who are drawn to the immediate presence of God at the heart of his people, and who choose to come and be part of that community are welcomed. And such an important theme here at this pivotal moment. This is no
Mm.
side story, is it? This is a
Yeah.
pivotal moment. And yeah, the presence of the foreigner there is really helpful. Something I noticed, if I may, while I'm
Yeah, go for it.
going
I'd love
through.
to hear your thoughts.
So this moment when the presence of God comes down upon the temple, it's not the first time this has happened.
Mm.
So this happens at the dedication of the tabernacle, back in the book of which we read about in the book of Exodus, where the same thing happens. The tabernacle is functionally the same thing as the temple. It's just happened to be in a tent. And at the dedication, the presence of God comes down in such might and power that the priests have to kind of scatter for a bit. Same thing happens here. And this, of course, is what we are seeing in Pentecost. This is what we are seeing in Acts 2, is the new temple. After we have met the perfect temple in Jesus Christ himself, then the church is anointed as the new temple. And the coming down of the Spirit in fire and smoke is a demonstration that this exact same thing is happening.
Mm.
So it just highlights for me, this passage, reading it as a Christian, reading it on the far side of Pentecost, and noticing what's going on here in the old covenant, but realizing this tracks forward into the new covenant. And
Mm.
this speaks to me about the high and holy calling that is placed upon the church, and the implications that it has in so many ways, including obviously our interaction with the world, our pursuit of justice, and all of these things that we pick up from time to time. So I think that we find that in one of the other readings, so I might just flag it up again there, but that's one of the things that particularly stands out to me here.
Yeah, no, I love that, and the connection with Pentecost and Acts 2 of all the nations coming together as
Mm,
well,
mm,
to celebrate and be included, and the preach being listened to in their language.
mm,
And I think that will connect with how God sees us and connects with people from many different backgrounds, including nationalities, people
mm,
from other countries as well being drawn in. And yeah, I love what you said as well about how we sometimes portray the Old Testament, I would even say as a whole, as, oh, this is just about God and the people of Israel. When actually it's not. There's a lot more there. And this passage is an example of that. So yeah, really, really exciting that we get to share that on Sunday.
thank you. Let's move on to Ephesians 6 then, which is begins as I suspect listeners will remember. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. What did you notice in this passage, Isabella?
Oh, I really love this passage. I think as a teenager, I I read this passage so many times, I've been like, yeah, I gotta be strong in the Lord. I need to know what to do and to be prepared and to wear the armor. Oh, I've been to so many conferences as a teenager and young adults about Ephesians 6, songs about Ephesians 6, dramas about Ephesians 6. So this is a passage that's really close to my heart. And I think what stands out to me here is about the source of evil, actually, that it's not about people,
Mm,
it's not about the rulers of this world.
mm,
Um, and I think ultimately it's not about our governments. Um, it's about the spiritual realm
mm,
that is behind it and is at work. And that's not to say that the governments, the rulers of this world, and everything else, they'll contribute to that, or they'll choose evil as well. But it's giving us the bigger picture of why the world is the way it is
mm,
and how we should act in that environment. So this passage, Helen, gives me hope that I shouldn't hate my president in Brazil or the prime
mm,
minister here, and I shouldn't speak poorly about either of them in terms of being rude, saying words that are not edifying to them. I should criticize. I should have discussions about the way that they lead, and that's healthy. But I shouldn't attack them personally because ultimately it's not about them. And actually, if I attack them personally, that's not what God wants us to do, to tear people down. He wants us to have conversations and to challenge people, to confront people when it's needed, but to do that in love, not
mm,
being passive, being active in love. And this passage reminds me of that and puts things into perspective. So when it says, put on the full armor of God so you can take stand against the devil's schemes. This is what I'm doing. I'm not putting on the full armor of God so I can um, go and resist the government or criticize or anything like this. So then I can stand against the devil's schemes. And part of that will be confronting the government, but they are not and I think, in practice it may look the same, but what's happening on our minds and the way with the motivation of our hearts, which I think God cares a lot about the motivation of
mm,
our hearts, is quite different actually. There's not fighting against people, but the spiritual realm. And then we know that we have God on our side and he gives us tools to do that. So the armor of God being described here as a breastplate of righteousness, and the feated with the readiness that comes with the gospel. I mean, there's so much here that I would want to unpack each one of those different bits of the armor that we wear and how it connects with the way that we live in society. What does that mean for the way we live in society rather than just making sure I keep my or strive for holiness like God, just as a personal pursuit, but actually in society, what does that look like to wear the armor of God, and prayer. And when it talks about praying in all occasions, and keeping in mind that we're praying for the Lord's people, that speaks to me as well. The power of prayer and the significance of prayer in spiritual warfare and in our everyday life in society, that we are to pray in all occasions, not only when things are going well, when things are when things are not going well, but also when things are going well. So it includes all those moments that we may want or may not want to pray. There's situations that I see in the news that I don't even, like you mentioned as we started, that I don't even want to think about. I just, and I know people that will refuse to look at the news and pretend like there's nothing happening, live in this fairy tale world, because they don't even want to think about it. But these passages encouraging us to pray in all occasions. So we do need to be informed of what's happening and pray and understand the spiritual dimension of things as well. And that's what speaks to me in this passage.
Thank you. Perhaps it gives me an opportunity to bang one drum that I bang from time to well, bang regularly actually, which is that we must have intercessions, prayers for the world in our church services. That I think it is our privilege and our duty to do that. And actually, personally, now I've got I have a personal conviction that I won't accept a preaching engagement unless I am given an assurance that there'll be intercessory prayer during the service, because I think it's so important. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Yeah.
Let's move on then to John 8, where Jesus kind of concludes the Bread of Life discourse, and then has a further conversation with his disciples, culminating in these glorious words of Simon Peter: "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God."
Yeah.
What do you make of this passage then, Isabella?
Oh, isn't that a beautiful passage? I just love that. And I can actually relate in John 6 to maybe some of the people that were there listening. It's very easy for us, and I grew up in church, so it's very easy for me to read this passage and be like, oh yeah, he's talking about the bread and his body as the bread and the drink as his blood and the flesh and all of that. But if we look at this passage with different eyes, you may understand why this is weird, and why they may have had questions about it. And when you understand the historical context and understand that some people are actually doing this sort of thing, then it puts everything into perspective. And I think for me, just the first reading, it just makes me think, don't look at this and think, oh yeah, they don't understand it. Why can they understand it? But look at it, I would look at it and think, yeah, it makes sense why they don't understand it. They should understand. They've been with Jesus. They know a little bit more. They've seen him feeding the 5,000. They've seen him walking on water. There's so much that's been happening. But it doesn't take away the human side of thinking, this is weird. You're talking about us eating your flesh. Surely that's not what you want us to do. And for some of the people there, they knew exactly what he was talking about, and they just didn't want to accept it. So there's a mix of the two, and that reminds me that when we are sharing about Jesus and our faith with others, we need to take that into consideration. There are some people that are out there to trick us, but there are some people that generally don't understand what's going on. And we see that because later on when Jesus talks to them, he says, well, God needs to enable people to understand this. And that gives me hope that God will enable people to understand it. But I think what Jesus was doing this is an inspiration for me on how I do my talks, stirring curiosity, really clever in the way that he's communicating, and opening conversation with people and revealing his identity. So in my talks, I need to always reveal God's identity, help people find God's identity. So I like that, but can't ignore the fact that he's talking about bread, and we need bread for survival. This is about provision as well. So he is our provision. This is how I read this. And with the influence of liberation theology as well in my upbringing in Brazil, I can't read this passage and not think of people that don't have bread. I can't read this passage and not think about the struggle that many have with finding food and the food poverty that we have in this country as well. So I understand of Jesus as provision, spiritual provision, but our responsibility as the church to provide for others as well, and sharing the bread of life in all of its senses. Um, and the last aspect that I noticed here is how some disciples don't like that. Some of the people following him said, actually, I'm out. This is not for me. This is a bit too crazy. This is a bit too bizarre. It's not for me. And and Jesus is not saying to them, no, 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 that's not what I meant. This is what I meant. It's not, he could do that, but that's not what he did. He's saying that's sad. But that's okay. And he asks his 12, are any of you, are you guys out as well? Are you staying? Like, what's going on? And Peter's response is what would my response should be to the Lord, even if at times, we may feel like, oh, I'm out of this. This is a bit too complicated, too much. So this have been my reflections on this passage.
Yeah, beautiful. And it reminds me of the other phrase, which says something similar: "Whom have I in heaven besides you?" Yeah, sometimes we, for a variety of reasons, and maybe for some very good reasons, we have challenges and doubts and questions and fears and concerns. And where else are we going to go? Where else are we going to go? Where's the better news? Because there isn't any.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, speaking of good news, let's go on to Psalm 84 and talk to us about this wonderful psalm.
Yeah, this psalm is, I think, what brings all these passages together for me. You can see from the psalmist the longing to find home in God, and the comparison with nature, and how they all have their homes, and I want a home too, and I want a home in you. I think that's what comes to me when I read these verses. And then he keeps talking about finding strength in God, heart set on pilgrimage as they pass through the valley of Baca, and make it a place of springs. And we know that's not what the valley of Baca is like. It's completely the opposite. It's finding an oasis. And he talks about provision again. This is about provision. Once again, finding home in God, finding strength in God, which connects with Ephesians 6, finding provision in God, which connects with the bread of life in John 6 as well. And it says, hear my prayer, hear my prayer. And how many times I look at the news, and this is my heart's cry, Lord, hear my prayer, Lord Almighty. Listen to me, God of Jacob. And I love those words, and we see that in the Psalms, in many of the other Psalms as well. But it's good that this is the way that it has been structured is there. And then it just speaks of the delight of being in the Lord's presence. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. And yeah, just beautiful, and ending with blessed the one who trusts in you. So it goes back to the core of it. And what Jesus says to the disciples, believe. Do you believe or do you not believe? Who do what do you think is going on here? And then Peter's response of, we believe you are the Holy One of God. And then in the psalm ending with, we trust in you. We blessed is the one who trusts in you. So I really connect with that. And I think connecting with the work I do with young adults, and being a young adult myself, the topic of home, the theme of home is such an important one. As you become a young adult, this is the stage of life where you would be leaving home. You will be thinking about maybe buying a place. Can we buy a place? I'm not sure. We can talk about cost of living crisis in all of that. But the longing to find home, and the longing to find belonging as well. A place to say, this is where I find identity. This is where I connect with people. This is where I find peace. This is where I find refuge. So connecting with the news that we mentioned in the beginning, I look at this psalm and this passage, and I think about those waiting for their GCSEs results. And when it gets to Sunday, they will have received their results. And the concern on their minds is, how can I be better prepared for the world so I can have a good life in a few years' times? And then as a young adult now, and hearing the perspectives of many other young adults that have done university, got the best grades, and still can't afford to find a home, this passage actually offers hope to those young people and saying whether you did well in your exams or as you expected or not as you expected, know that true home can be found in God and your strength is in Him, and blessed is the one who trusts in Him. So I think that's an encouragement as we look at what's been happening in the judgment with the riots and the fear that is spread among so many foreigners like myself, and knowing that it's better to spend time in the Lord's courts than 1,000 elsewhere. So the longing to be with God and connecting with God and saying, yes, Lord, you are the place of refuge and comfort for me. And where everything else in the news seems to be upside down, out of order, completely out of order, I think that's an understatement to say that it's out of order, actually. And the wars in the world and the hope that seems lost. When I look at this passage and I see in verse 8, hear my prayer, Lord Almighty, hear my prayer. So I think this is a great passage to be meditating on Sunday and connecting with everything else that's happening in the news. And in my perspective, I think, particularly speaking to the younger generations about finding home, belonging, comfort, refuge in the Lord. So I really like this passage.
Wonderful, thank you. And one more thing, I love all that you said. One more thing, which is that you touched on this. These people who are being pilgrims, and as they're journeying in the psalmist's mind towards the temple in Jerusalem, they pass through this dry valley,
Mm.
and they make it a place of springs. Now, obviously, this is a metaphor, this is an image, but it is a vision,
Yeah.
I think, for how the pilgrim people of God should be bringing blessing as they go. Now, often we do that very intentionally, and rightly so. There are many things that choices we choose to make. We choose to support this situation, or we choose to set up this project, or to act in this way, and those are very important things, of course. But for me, there's something in this passage about the unconscious blessing
Mm.
that God's people, if we are being faithful, and as we kind of journey, as we pilgrim through our life, faithfully and in a worshipping heart, that there should be a kind of blessing that incidentally kind of crops up, as it were, around us because of that, I think. And I just find that a very inspiring vision, perhaps almost like, when you have someone come to visit and then they leave and there's a fragrance behind, and they
Yeah.
haven't kind of squirted the fragrance around, but it's just they've left their fragrance. And I wonder if it's that sort of, I don't know. I love that image, and I find that very challenging. Lord, may that be true for me, that as I unconsciously, the times when I'm not, actively thinking about how can I bless this person or whatever, that may blessing erupt, or in my wake, as it were, or in our wake as church. Wonderful. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely, Helen. And that connects with something else that's been on my mind as well, that when we find home in God, we make home for others, we make
Yeah.
room for others, and we welcome others. And it's not just, I guess, again, what we were talking about in Ephesians 6, it's not an individual thing. Our faith is not an individual thing. Our faith is a collective thing. So when we talk about finding home in God, it's not just about me, Isabella, you, Helen. Finding home in God is about us finding home in God and opening the literal doors of our home, whether they be the place where you live, your country, whether they may be society, whether they may be the spaces you are in that you hold power and influence, but literally open those doors so people can find home in these spaces as well, because we are modeling what God Himself does for us. He didn't, the temple with the cloud there in 1 Kings 8, the weight of His presence is incredible. It's like this. I'm speechless. There's no words that can describe that. And still, He welcomes us, and He makes His temple within us. And if that's not an encouragement for us to open our homes for others, I don't know what it is. Home may be what it is for you. Um, and hospitality is a big thing for me, so that's quite important. but home can be the places of influence that you have as well. And what you said about being pilgrims and a place that is dry becoming where springs are there. For me, that's the confirmation of that finding home in God means making space for others as well and sharing their blessings.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we're coming towards the end of our discussion. I'd like to ask you one more question, if I may, which is to ask you how are you praying for the country, the world, in these days?
Yeah, I am particularly praying against racism, Helen. I have friends and people close to me who in the past weeks have, sorry if I get emotional, have felt so scared of leaving their homes. And their homes had to be a refuge for them because they were scared of the looks of people on the streets and were planning to see friends or planning to do all sorts of things and fear to stop them. And in talking to them and in reflecting my own perspective, my fear of being outside of home as well, for that very reason, because I can't hide who I am. I can't hide that I don't fit what they are, what they're hating. And my prayer has been, Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. There's no a human reaction to it. It needs to be you, like what Jesus is saying to the disciples, enable me to pray in all occasions, to say, Lord, have mercy. So when I look at the news of the riots have been on my mind, and I'm saying, Lord, have mercy, do justice. Because we know, well, the conversations I've been having with people, my own reflections that the issue that we have with racism it's not something that we're going to put people behind prison cells and it's all sorted. Oh, and now peace is restored. No, this is something that's been bubbling away for a long, long, long time. And now we get to see its head. But actually, I've been seeing its head all the time. Everyone else is seeing its heads now, but for me, that's nothing new. So my prayer is, Lord, have mercy. And trusting his ultimate justice and the promise, the hope of eternal life where tears will be dried and there will be no more mourning and no more violence, no more prejudice. So I'm praying particularly for the world using these words, Lord, have mercy. And looking at the news of wars and all of that, and that's my prayer. Sometimes all through a tear, but that's my prayer.
Thank you. Lord, have mercy indeed. And begin it with me, with my heart. Thank you so much, Isabella, for joining us for the rich conversation. I've really enjoyed it and learnt from it, and I'm sure our listeners likewise will have appreciated it.
Thank you, Helen, for having me. It's been really good, and I hope everyone's really blessed by these passages on Sunday, and encouraged as well.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Public Issues, or using #PoliticsInThePulpit. And we also have a Facebook group which you can access through the Joint Public Issue Team's Facebook page and the website jpit.uk. That's jpit.uk. Well, it's been a privilege hosting the podcast in this summer season, but this is my final episode. So I thought that I would sign out with the Aaronic blessing. And I think I may have used it in an earlier podcast in this season, but it certainly bears repetition. And this is the way that Aaron the high priest was instructed to bless the people around him, to bless the people of God. And maybe this can form a pattern for how we seek to be that sort of blessing we were speaking about in the Valley of Baca. So this is me signing out from this summer season of Politics in the Pulpit with these words. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you, and may he be gracious to you. The Lord lift his face towards you and give you peace. So this is me signing out from this